I'll keep time as well. Okay. Okay, well, first of all, thanks so much to Professor Underwood and to BYU for having me. It's good to be back here. I was here at a conference 2 years ago. Okay, so Tarek did a very good job of laying the groundwork for what I'm going to talk about. Because we still have a problem, right? We haven't resolved the problem. So, yes, it is true that there is a kind of global democratic decline, but there still is something unique about certainly the Middle East, but also more broadly about Muslim majority countries when it comes to levels of freedom and democracy. If we focus on the Middle East, there aren't any full democracies. The only two sort of democracies are Iraq and Lebanon. And when you're trying to say that there's democracies in the Middle East by pointing to Iraq and Lebanon, you know you're probably not on strong ground. So there's that. So we intuitively know that something is wrong, and I think we have to speak frankly about it, because there has to be some sort of reason here. Why is this region, the Middle East, so profoundly undemocratic, so profoundly authoritarian? The Middle East is messed up. I mean, we know this, and it's depressing for those of us who study the region, who care about the region, who are originally from the region, so on and so forth. Tarek already mentioned that there used to be a bright spot in the Middle East, Tunisia, and it's interesting. I'm finishing up a book, and I'm editing parts of it, and I had something that said there are three partial or full democracies in the Middle East: Tunisia, Iraq, and Lebanon. And now I had to sort of like in track changes with the red, I just crossed out Tunisia. And it was like sad because like I was actually doing that in real time, and now Tunisia is gone. So that's sort of where we're at. So what I'll try to do here, as the title of our session suggests, is to look at how Islam interacts with contemporary politics. And we already talked about yesterday and this morning about, Islam is a complex thing, so we can kind of put it in scare quotes sometimes. So the problem isn't Islam, or let's put it this way. The problem isn't Islam itself. I'm going to make a little bit of a different argument that there is a problem, and the problem is the inability to resolve the question of Islam's role in public life. The Middle East and Middle Eastern countries have not been able to resolve that foundational question of what role Islam should play and Islam's relationship to the state and the state's relationship to Islam. These are fundamental questions. They're very challenging, and they remain unresolved to this day in most of these countries. So if you look at polling, not to belabor this because others have touched on it, if you look at polling, very large majorities in the Middle East say that Islam is very important in their daily lives. And I was actually going back through some of the Pew research. So the latest Pew poll on this is from 2020. And I had some data, and I read through it, and I was like, this can't be right. I looked at the numbers for Tunisia. 99% of Tunisians say that God is important in their daily life. That's pretty high. The number for prayer, which is a little bit of a different indicator, 97% of Tunisians say that prayer is important in their lives. There's a couple things to take from this. First and foremost, a lot of Tunisians are lying. So we know that. Because, and I know many of them who don't actually, prayer isn't definitely not very important or important in their daily life. Anyway, this is interesting because there still is a sense of pressure that you're supposed to say. If someone asks you, is prayer important to you, you're going to feel that you should say yes, even if it isn't actually important to you. I mean, we all do this, social pressures. The reason I bring up Tunisia, because Tunisia is a little bit of an extreme case, it's probably the most secularized Arab country. So even in the most secular country, 97% of Tunisians are saying that prayer is important to them. Let's go one step further. Large majorities in most Arab countries say that they want Islam and Islamic law to play a prominent role in public life. In some of these countries, we're talking about 80 to 90% who say this. Not Tunisia, but some of the more religiously conservative countries like Egypt and Jordan and so on. So clearly what we have here is a broad popular desire to not be secular or to have Islamic law playing some kind of role. Now, the problem here is that, let's say you have 50 Muslims who say they think that Sharia should play an important role in public life. And I've actually done this to some extent. In my field work, I would spend a lot of time with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. And I would just ask them, and they're all Islamists, and they're all part of more or less the same organization. And I would ask, like, what does it mean to you to implement Sharia? And even amongst themselves, they would disagree and give me somewhat, fairly different answers. If you're asking Muslims more broadly, 50 Muslims, what does it mean? What does Sharia mean to you? You'll get 50 quite divergent answers. You can maybe do this test with the Muslims here, and you could probably see that that would be the case amongst us as well. Now, so this creates a problem because you have this desire for Islam to play this important role, but Muslims don't agree on what that role should be. So what ends up happening is that the main political cleavage in the Middle East is around precisely this question: what to do about Islam, what to do about Islamic law. There's disagreement, and that's what creates a divide. So what you end up having is Islamists on one hand, secularists on the other, and many shades in between. And this is obviously an oversimplification. We can have a debate about what secular means in the Middle Eastern context, and I'll talk briefly about what Islamism actually is. But the point here is that this is what people are disagreeing fundamentally about. They don't agree on the role of Islam. Now let's contrast this to say, if we had talked 10 years ago, I would have contrasted this, what I've just described in the Middle East, with the United States, my own country. And you might recall 10 years ago, it's a long time ago, and it's a little bit blurry for a lot of us, but in the Obama era, people were debating things like healthcare policy, taxes. There was even this thing where President Obama, some of you might not remember this, but he wore a tan suit, and it became an actual controversy in the media. That's what we were discussing at that time. But what's important here is that let's take something more serious. I think healthcare policy is pretty serious, but it's tangible. You can compromise on it. You can split the middle, so to speak. But how do you split the middle on metaphysical questions? How do you split the middle on questions around identity, culture, and religion that are hard to quantify? And that's part of the problem we have in various Arab countries. To take two examples, in the Arab Spring, in Egypt and Tunisia, there were big problems around economic inequality, around unemployment, and you would talk to ordinary people and they would raise these concerns, at least some of the time. But what was interesting is that when political parties started to organize in this period of political opening, what did they actually choose to emphasize? They didn't actually talk all that much about tax policy or healthcare or economic reform or things like that. They talked a lot about identity, culture, and religion. And a lot of those discussions had to do with the sensitive gender equality, role of religious minorities, and what role Islam should play, so on and so forth. So that became, again, the key cleavage, and we saw that play out in the Arab Spring in these various countries. Again, the role of Islam in public life, Islam's relationship to the state, and the state's relationship to Islam. Okay, so I mentioned the state here, and this is what I want to just dwell on for a second or two. The state. It's worth remembering that there wasn't always a nation state. The nation state is a relatively modern innovation. It's so modern, in fact, that there are some people left in the world who were alive technically before the formal abolition of the last caliphate, which happened in 1924. So if you're 97 and you live in what was previously the Ottoman Empire, you were technically alive when there was a caliphate. But I don't think there are any Turks or really anyone left, unless you're maybe 110, who will have an actual memory of what it was like to live under a caliphate. This is all to say that this only happened in the last 100 years or so, is that we have something new called the state. And I'm going to get to this in a moment. The state becomes a problem in the story that I'm telling you. But before we go into all that, I just want to say a couple words about Islamism and Islamists. So we've talked about this word yesterday and today. Just so we're on the same page, I'll offer a little definition, just so we know what we're talking about. It's very broad and fairly simple. Islamists are those that believe that Islam or Islamic law should play a central role in public life and politics. That's the broadest sort of umbrella definition. Now, you can kind of go into a lot more detail, but that's a good starting point. Because that's a big umbrella, we can distinguish between various kinds of Islamist group. And on the far right of the spectrum, we have violent, radical, extremist Islamists like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the ones that we hear about in the news the most. The far right. And then the vast majority of Islamists are not, though, Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever. They're what I would call mainstream Islamists, in the sense that they are peaceful, they participate in the political process, they're gradualists, not revolutionaries. They are part of their societies. They accept the nation state, however grudgingly, so on and so forth. So the most well-known of these mainstream Islamist movements is the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's probably one that you've heard a lot about. There are Muslim Brotherhood branches and affiliates throughout the world. There's even a small one here in the U.S., or an analog to it, let's say. So this is a very common thing, and okay. So the vast majority of Islamists are peaceful, but there's something else which I think is more interesting than this. So Islamists are often portrayed as anti-modern, but I would argue, this is actually a fact I would say, they are very much a product of modern life. So you can't actually understand Islamists without understanding modernity and what modernity produces. And just to be more specific about what I mean there, say you went back 5 centuries, and you had said the word Islamists, even in Arabic, the Islamiyun, you would have gotten blank stares 5 centuries ago. There was no such thing as Islamists in the pre-modern era. They did not exist. In the pre-modern era, Islam provided an overarching legal and moral architecture. It imbued everything. It went without saying, so it wasn't said. There was no reason to say that you believed Islam should play a central role in public life, because it already played a central role in public life, and that was that. But then something happened. So that for the better part of 14 centuries of Islamic history, we don't have Islamists, because Islam is just the way things are. For the most, with very few exceptions, people don't question that overarching order. Then something happens, primarily in the 19th century. And then moving into the 20th century, secular ideologies are introduced. They gain traction among governing elites. And now you no longer have one vision, you have two. So as these new secular ideas gain ground, you have secular elites, to generalize. Then you have a reaction to those secular elites. So you have these groups that start to form, that start saying that they are Islamic. And they're very self-consciously Islamic. They're trying to push back and make Islam relevant to politics again. They're afraid that Islam is going to be privatized. If you will, they want to make Islam great again. And that could be sort of like one of the, someone should use that in the Middle East. It's catchy. So to put it differently, you can't have Islamists without secularists. Each relies on its opposite. Or as someone said yesterday, I think, the presence of things is made more conspicuous by their absence. And the same can be said for Islam. Once you have the sense that Islam is being taken away from you, then you're going to be active in trying to reintroduce it. So here we have the Muslim Brotherhood entering into our story. Oldest, largest Islamist movement, as I said, founded in 1928 by a school teacher. A couple interesting things about the Brotherhood very quickly. They're very bottom up. Shireen mentioned some of this yesterday. Their vision of changing society was that you would start with yourself and your heart. You'd become a better Muslim. Then if you became a better Muslim, then you'd have a Muslim family. A bunch of Muslim families would mean that you would have a bunch of Islamic communities. It would keep on going up stage by stage. If you have a more Islamic society, what happens at the end of this story? The government reflects that Islamization. And so you would think organically, the government, people who rule you, will also become more Islamic because they're drawing from the society itself. Well, it didn't work out that way. And we'll get to why. Also, the other thing about the Muslim Brotherhood, they're very gradualist. They're very slow. And I remember I was always amazed in talking to Brotherhood leaders and activists. They never seemed to be in a rush. And they would always say things. They were exaggerating, probably. But I think there was a kernel of truth there. They would always talk about how they have a very long time horizon. And that gave them a built-in advantage. I think that's partly true. So, but basically, you have an issue here. Those are two important aspects of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then there's the modernism that I mentioned just a moment ago. And basically, what they wanted to do was to take a religion, and they were asking themselves, how do we apply this religion to modern life? That is the fundamental question that the Brotherhood is asking. So in this sense, they have an interest in modernizing Islam and finding ways to make it more relevant in people's lives. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. It's not self-evident how you might do this. Part of it has to do with, okay, well, what about Islamic law? You can't find Islamic law in a book. So this is part of the challenge. As we saw yesterday, Islamic law is a rich, organic, multifaceted thing. And what is the modern way of talking about law, including in this country? Law is something you codify, it's something you implement, it's something you can read in law books and law manuals, you read statutes on a page, and then you apply the law. And the word apply is very important here, because that wouldn't have made sense in the pre-modern era. So if you want to modernize Islam, then you have to think about how to apply Islamic law in this very modern sense of coming up with rules and figuring out how to apply them. And this is why Islamists use a phrase that was not really common before, tatbiq al-Sharia, which means the implementation or the application of Sharia. You're applying something in this very specific way. So, in short, and there's also kind of like interesting, a lot of Islamists are engineers and doctors. So they have a very technical way of looking at things. So this also makes sense to them that if you're an engineer, 1 + 1 = 2. If you want to apply law, then you have a specific way of applying it. And Islamists themselves have a very interesting phrase, another phrase that they use. They talk about al-mashru' al-Islami, which means the Islamic project. And that's like a weird way to talk about your religion. They talk about like we want to have this Islamic project and implement it. That is a fairly modern way of talking about religion. Again, it's very focused. What do we think about when we're applying something or coming up with a project in school? It means that you're trying to do something very specific and you have a plan, a vision, so on and so forth. Okay, so if I had to sum it up, I would say, and this gets a little bit more to what Islamism is fundamentally about, and I think this is really important to understand, which is basically that Islamism is the attempt to reconcile pre-modern Islamic law with the modern nation state. At least to me, that is the project of Islam more broadly. But this is a problem because it's trying to square an impossible circle. And I don't want to go into too much controversial territory here. And some people might have some disagreements with how I put this. But I would say, I think it's somewhat self-evident that Islam wasn't designed for the modern nation state. Almost by definition, Islam was revealed in 7th century Arabia to people who didn't know what a nation state was. There were no actual nation states in the modern sense at that time. And, you know, naturally, if Islam was revealed in a different time, in a different context, where there were nation states, presumably the message would be at least somewhat different. So you have an issue here is that Islam is not, and Islam is as it has developed over centuries, the classical tradition that you've heard about the last 2 days, it didn't really develop with the nation state in mind. Okay, so this brings us back to the present moment, and here's where I'll start to kind of close up in my last 9 minutes or so. So what do you? I've offered a lot to you. Now, what I'm going to try to do here is to at least tell you from my perspective what this all means today in the modern Middle East. How do we make sense of all this information? This is, somewhat complicated stuff. There's a long history here. Why does politics feel so existential in the Middle East, but also, for that matter, in our own country? And again, it's worth emphasizing that this feeling that we have that politics is existential, that the stakes are so high, I saw that in the Arab Spring when I was living in the Middle East at the time. It's spreading throughout the world. So in some ways, the Middle East was ahead of its time. It was pointing us to our new future, one that we will all likely share, where elections are very frightening events because so much is at stake. But why is so much at stake? Why do we feel this way about our elections? Part of it is because whoever wins an election gains control of the state. So this is where I come back to the question of the modern nation state. And this state has a machinery. It has a power to it. The nation state, as we said, is relatively new, but there's also the fact that the nation state has grown tremendously powerful, especially in the last 50 years or so. It can repress and kill. Technological advances allow the state to put citizens under perpetual surveillance. The state has bloated bureaucracies, especially in the Middle East. Anyone who's lived in the Middle East will know what Middle Eastern bureaucracies are like. They employ as much as 10% of the population as public sector employees in one way or another. Even if these people don't actually work, they're just kind of on the rolls. And so there's a lot of dependency on the state. And people look up to the state to be there for them, to kind of provide, so on and so forth. And this creates a problem. Like, it's at some level, we want states to get things done, but it also means that everyone wants control of the state machinery. So naturally, elections, if they happen in the Middle East, they feel existential because whoever wins is in a very powerful position to use the state to reshape society. So Islamists want to reshape society in their own image, obviously. Non-Islamists want to prevent Islamists from coming to power because they don't want Islamists to reshape society. So that's the fundamental divide, or at least one of the fundamental divides right there. One of the major changes of the past 30 years is that mainstream Islamists, like the Muslim Brotherhood, came to accept and even embrace democracy. Not liberal democracy, but procedural democracy. The idea that you choose your leaders through elections and you rotate power every few years. So they began focusing more attention and resources on elections, which they hadn't done previously, because these are Islamist movements. They're not political parties. A movement has a broader set of concerns. They care about preaching and education. They care about having parallel structures in societies where they build networks of institutions. So if you go to let's take Egypt or Jordan and so on, you'll find that Islamist movements have a network of businesses, mosque clinics, hospitals, even Boy Scout troops. I mean, you name it. They have this kind of, I don't want to say state within a state because that makes it sound frightening, but it's a kind of set of parallel state institutions. Okay, so at some point, basically what happened is Muslim Brotherhood movements realized that their bottom-up model wasn't going to be enough, because they tried to reshape society. People did become more religious. There was an Islamic revival starting in the 70s, intensifying in the 80s, and continuing to one degree or another to this day. But then there was a gap they didn't really address. So you had more Islamic societies, but that wasn't reflected in government. So Islamists started to ask themselves, how do we close that gap? The conclusion they came to is they have to contest elections seriously. And this is where we are now. So this is the problem perpetually. Every time you have a free election, In the Middle East, Islamists either win or do quite well, and then this provokes counter reactions from those who are afraid of Islamists coming to power. So we're at an impasse. And as I finish here, I will at least try to offer a couple options of what we do about, and I just mean we in the royal sense. I mean, there's not a whole lot we can do here, although America does play a role. I don't want to go into that too much because it's a little bit afield from what we're talking about. But if we, who's afraid of Islamists coming to power in the Middle East? Secularists in these countries are, but also a lot of other people. A lot of people don't like Islamist parties for legitimate reasons. But it's not just Arabs themselves in these societies who oppose Islamists coming to power. The U.S. also does. And Tariq alluded to this briefly, that in the case of Algeria was a very obvious one, where the U.S., France, and others did support the military coup. Part of what I'm working on now in this new book is it goes into a lot of detail about how the Obama administration, in my view, based on my argument, gave what amounted to a green light to the Egyptian military to undo election results and to stage a coup. That happened in 2013, as many of you might know. The Brotherhood had come to power through free elections, and then they were ousted about a year later. Okay, so what do we do about this impasse? Part of the many problems that I've been discussing is that you can't stop Islamists from being Islamists, and you can't stop ordinary people from voting for Islamists except through force, except through coercion. And even then, it's very difficult to do. But also from a normative perspective, as those of us here, mostly Americans, but also I assume most people here believe in some modicum of democracy or like some basic rights, we probably have normative objections to using coercion to force people to be something they don't want to be. So that option isn't ideal. A lot of people like that option in the Middle East, using force, but we probably want to avoid it. And I don't want to go too much into like what I saw happen in Egypt, but most of my I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania, but my parents are originally Egyptian. Most of my relatives are still there. Most of my family, some of whom are very nice, dear people, some of whom I love, some of them. There was a massacre that happened after the military coup that I just mentioned in August 2013. More than 1,000 people were killed in broad daylight by the military. Most of my family supported that massacre and were relatively open with me about how they thought this was a good thing. I don't want to go into what was exactly going into their mind. I will just say that you can be an otherwise good person and support evil things. We know this throughout history. They thought the stakes were too existential, and they said it's either us or them. You and your Americans with your democracy talk, we're the ones who have to live in this country. And you know what? This is probably bad, but it's what has to happen. That's the kind of thinking that people can use to justify. So what's the alternative to that, to what my family in Egypt, what they thought about this massacre, coercion, all of this? That's one way of doing it. The second way, the alternative, and as you can guess, this is the choice that I lean towards. The alternative is to try to accommodate Islam's role in public life. And sometimes that means accommodating Islamists in public life. That doesn't mean we have to like Islamists. And on things that I think many of us as Americans care about, gender equality, minority rights, we might think that some of what Islamists believe is bad, beyond the pale, very disturbing. So it's fine to dislike groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and even dislike them quite strongly. But our personal preferences in this regard, I would argue, are irrelevant because bad people are allowed to contest elections. It happens in this country, as we know. Bad people are part of elections everywhere, almost, that there are democratic elections. So you can't just say that, oh, they're bad, therefore we can't have them participate. And this is where it really gets to a fundamental question about how we understand the democratic idea. Democracy at its core is about reflecting popular preferences. So if 80% of people want some aspect of Islam to play a role in politics, then a democratically elected government should be able to reflect that. That's what democracies do. And that means that Muslims, like everyone else, they have the right to make the wrong choice. And I think that's a big part of what democracy is about, and it will become probably an even bigger part of democracy in the years and decades to come, unfortunately. But the thing is, it's in the eye of the beholder. One person's wrong choice is another person's right choice, and we can't necessarily agree on that, even in this country. Some people think that one party is very good, other people think that party is very bad, and that is for democracy to survive in places that are ideologically polarized. At some level, you have to come to terms with the possibility that your opponents, your adversaries, even your enemies might win. And they might legitimately be in power for years to come. There's no way to get around that. So I'll end there. Thank you.